Hello, welcome to Module 7 of the Watershed Wise Landscape Professional Certification Program. This is our favorite module of all time. This is it. This is the reason, really, that we created this whole program, was because conventional irrigation and even landscape-related studies and courses only talked about soil texture, not living soil. So we get a moment now. I want you all, just take a moment. I want you to imagine in your head your favorite plant, right? What could it be? Have an image? Ready? Well, how many of you imagined the roots in your picture? Yeah, so we're not trained to think about the roots in our mental image of the plant. But what's interesting is that most of what's happening for a plant is actually happening below ground. 80% or more of what's going on for that plant is below ground. I mean, above ground, we have the photosynthesis process, in action, and we have reproduction going on, in action. And yet that is not really the energy of the plant. Most of what is happening in the root zone of the plants. Now, I'm not saying that 80% of the mass of the plant is in the soil. I'm saying that 80% of the energy is in the soil. And that's really something for us to start to think about. So when we envision a plant, we need to start to envision that, that root zone as part of it, because what we have is really, when we have a healthy plant, right around that plant, we have something called living soil. And living soil is not dirt. Dirt is a 4-letter word. It is a bad word. Dirt is basically compacted soil, devoid of life. It has no good balance of oxygen and water in it. It really only could support plants if it was given tremendous amount of inputs of water and fertilizer and stuff like that. That's the only way that dirt can really support plant life. Living soil is totally different. It is the basis of all life. It's filled with just a huge abundance of microbial creature, organisms, fungal organisms, and they're all working together for the benefit of the plant, really. And the plant is orchestrating everything that's happening in its root zone. So this is a really different paradigm for soil and for imagining how soil behaves. And we think it has a tremendous impact on all of that work that we've done on total irrigation runtime and thinking about irrigation, not taking the life of soil into account, we think really is a disservice to irrigation. So we're going to start with the sort of fundamentals and then build on them with soil. We like to describe living soil as oxygen, water, and life. OWL is the acronym. It's kind of the spirit animal for G3 is the owl, and it stands for oxygen, water, and life. And if you think about it, right, the whole purpose of irrigation is to maintain a balance of water and oxygen in the soil, right? Remember, if there's too much water in the soil, it's saturated, and so there's no oxygen, and that's not a good condition. And if there's too much oxygen, not enough water, that's not a good condition. So we manage the balance of oxygen and water in the soil. But why do we manage that balance? We manage that balance so that we can have the abundant life that we need to be in the soil to support our plants. And another thing to think about with soil generally is that we're accustomed to thinking again about soil type, about the particles of soil and the relative size of those particles. But I want us to also think about what's not there. So when you take a sample of soil, it's got the minerals and it's got the mineral particle. Oh, what's going on? Is this like magic? I literally wave my hands and that's strange. Anyway, it's got the mineral particles in it. It also has organic matter particles. So those are little bits and pieces of various forms of organic matter. But then half of that sample is going to be void space. It's going to be oxygen, essentially. And within that oxygen space, or within that void space, is going to exist some water. And then in the water is going to exist the living organisms, the microbes, and they occupy all of the pore space of the soil. So this is kind of something to get your head around, is that, yes, you know, in a soil sample, if we burned away all the oxygen, the soil sample would be half the volume that, or half the what if half the mass? That's a good question. But anyway, certainly half of what you have is particles of mineral, and then you burn away the organic matter, and then that's all you're left with is the mineral. But that doesn't compare to what a soil sample actually is. The soil sample is the organic matter and the void space filled with oxygen, water, and the life. And so, as we said, OWL is the only thing that you can do to create healthy living soil. It is the essential component of landscaping, of really all land management. And it's that balance of OWL that gives us a guarantee that we can actually make it through a time of drought or a time of deluge. And what is happening in the soil is there's a giant soil party going on. And I think this is like something that when I first encountered this about 15 years ago, I mean, I looked through a microscope and saw what was going on in soil, and it just blew my mind. So in a teaspoon of good, healthy soil, there are billions of creatures, more creatures in that teaspoon of soil than there are humans on top of the planet. Let's get our head around that, okay? And there are so many, there's so great a diversity and so great an abundance of creatures. We do not know who most of them are. Like you know, some of them have been categorized. So some of the major players have been categorized. But honestly, there is so much DNA testing being done right now on soil to try to determine who all these microbes are, because, you know, we just don't know them. We've never encountered them before in some cases. And so it's a brave new frontier in terms of science, and certainly in terms of land science, so agriculture and other land science, really understanding that the soil is alive. It is more alive than it's dead. And those microbes that are in the soil are actually, they're working together to mine mineral out of the soil and manufacture different forms of carbon, essentially, mostly carbon compounds that they can then feed to each other and to a plant. And in exchange, the plant gives them all kinds of yummy, also carbon-based compounds that are kind of like cakes and cookies. They're mostly like carbohydrates, but they're also lipids and other enzymes that are being created by the plant and fed to this huge soil party, so that the soil party will continue to mine and transform materials that are in the soil and turn it into nutrition for each other and for the plant. Pretty freaking amazing, actually. And this, I cannot emphasize enough how, you know, it's all, you know, if I believed in magic, it would be magical. It is mind-blowing, though, that that plants have evolved to conduct these incredible functions. So the plant uses the energy of the sun, and through photosynthesis, which is an amazing it's just an amazing thing. But through photosynthesis, the plant is able to take out of the atmosphere carbon dioxide, and it takes that carbon dioxide out, and it actually then begins to split up the carbon and the oxygen. It releases the oxygen. The process requires water. This is what evapotranspiration is cooling down. Oh, by the way, if you think about it, plants' leaves are solar panels. And so you need to keep those solar panels cool. And the way that you do that is you bring water from the soil up to the leaves to cool them off when that evaporates into or transpires really into the atmosphere. That is like an air conditioning. It's a cooling down of the plant. And so the photosynthesis is, the evapotranspiration is part of the photosynthesis process. The plant's taking this carbon out of the atmosphere and it's converting it into all of these carbon chains. And I mean, there are thousands of different carbon combinations that the plant is manufacturing, and it's doing it to build its body, of course. So it needs to build the organic matter in its body. It needs to fuel the reproductive process of flowers and fruit and so on. And all of that's happening above ground. But then the plant takes these carbon packets and actually pushes it down into the roots and out through the roots in a liquid form that is attractive to the members of the soil party. Now, which members of the soil party? Get this, the plant manufactures the compounds that the particular microbial community needs in order to get the goods and services from the microbes. So, need a little zinc, I'm going to manufacture this compound and bring this microbial community in so it will manufacture zinc for me. I need a little water, I'm going to make this compound to feed the fungal network or other microbes that are going to help me to sequester water. I need some calcium. All right, we're going to create this other compound and feed it to a microbial community that is good at mining calcium out of the soil. The plant's in control. The plant is the engineer, if you would, of its own environment. And left to its own devices, it would be able to create the conditions around it that would ensure its growth and health. And part of that growth and health is that it has a vast microbial community at its roots, and that those microbes create a spongy soil, spongy texture, a spongy structured soil, so that water can be held at the roots of the plants for the plant when it needs it to cool itself off from photosynthesis. So pretty awesome, really. It's totally awesome. And plants, not beside being engineers, and having this like, okay, I'm going to talk about plants as though they're sentient. And some of you may be down with that, but it's going to get weird when I really talk about the soil being sentient. I encourage you to watch some of the additional resources in this section, because there are brilliant minds from around the world talking about what is the wood wide web and what's really going on in soil and the sentience of soil. It really will change your mind about how we treat, Mother Earth. So not only are they engineers, but they are also farmers, right? Because they are actually managing and growing these microbial communities so that it ensures that they will have longevity. And really what they're doing when they create these liquid carbon strands is they're sending invitations out, because sometimes that microbial community isn't at their roots already, and they need them. So in order to make it attractive for those microbes to grow at their roots, they will send out these particular carbohydrate, or we call them cakes and cookies, right? They'll send out these particular materials and attract the right microbes to the soil. And now this this material that they're sending out is called exudates, and exudates are kind of like a fingernail or hair growth, right? In humans, you don't really think about it, but you know, this is organic matter coming off of you, and those exudates are coming off of, sloughing out of the roots of the plants, and become essentially the food or the attractive thing that brings them in. And again, it's very particular. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning right now is that when I'm talking about creating like nutrient for a plant available nutrient, the quantity of the particular nutrient or mineral or whatever it is that the plant is getting back from the microbes is so minuscule that it's almost undetectable. And that is a really interesting thing. It's so the benefit is that what's being made, the plant available nutrient, is a living material that's being given to the plant, and it can be in a very low form, because the plant knows exactly what it needs in exactly the quantity that it needs. So it's like, you know, it doesn't need 25 milligrams of something, right? You know, it's not taking a pill. It needs 2 milligrams of it at this particular time. And so it's asking the soil party to create that quantity for it at that particular time. And the relationship is so symbiotic that it never needs more than what it's asking for. And it never is presented with more than what it is asking for. It's a completely symbiotic, balanced thing that's going on. So these are the invitations that would go out to people, to the participants of the soil party. Let's meet them and see what they're up to. Because first to the party is going to be the bacteria. Now, bacteria is, I mean, it's amazing. It can basically eat anything. It can digest pretty much any organic matter. It can digest the parent rock in the soil, and it actually transforms that parent rock into a nutrient that it can hold in its body. So bacteria are always the first to the party, and they just need a drop of water to wake up and start doing their thing. Now, there are a bunch of challenges with bacteria. One of the things is they don't have feet, so they don't move around very much. So if you don't have a good bacteria population in your soil, you're going to need to bring it in on the foot of a bird, you know, or the wing of a butterfly. It needs to be transported into the garden or into the area around the plant. But once it's there, it really does do the heavy lifting in terms of decomposition. Now, here's another challenge for bacteria. It actually cannot release the nutrition that it creates on the you know, for the plant. It's stuck in its body. So we kind of get a bunch of bacteria that will all divide to kind of make more space and put nutrition around. And eventually we grow a nice, you know, bacterial slimy thing that will attract the protozoa. Protozoa are awesome swimmers. And don't forget that soil is a water environment. So the protozoa come, they zip around the soil, swimming with their little flagella out, and they consume the bacteria. Now, an interesting thing, this is actually how nitrogen gets released in soil, because the bacteria can fix the nitrogen, but then the protozoa actually get it to be released. So, and there are other things like that, but the protozoa will eat all these bacteria. They're very attracted to it. And so for now, we're starting to have nutrient cycling going on. There's a transformation of the nutrition that the original bacteria had created from the parent rock. And when you have juicy bacteria and delicious protozoa in the soil, for sure, the next to the party is going to be the nematodes. And nematodes are real swimmers. You know, they zip around. Yes, there are some bad actors in the nematode bunch, but the good news is that if you have diversity in the soil, the good nematodes will out compete the bad nematodes. Nematodes actually are able to connect up into the roots of plants. They are swimming around the soil and they're eating bacteria, they're eating protozoa. And for the first time in our little soil party that we've got going on here, we actually have nutrition that could be taken by the plant and utilized by the plant. So we have plant available nutrition, and it's being manufactured by these bacteria, protozoa, and nematodes all working together. The challenge is that it's still young. It's like, it's not, the soil is not yet really, you know, the soil party is not this big, robust party. There aren't, you know, the Google billions and billions, right? Now watch, things are going to turn on in my office. There aren't the billions and billions of microbes there yet. It's still a young party. The cycling of nutrient isn't quite as robust as it needs to be. So guess who comes next? These guys, the weeds. Yeah. Why? Well, because there is plant available nutrient, so it can support plant life. But the plants that are going to come are going to be the plants that have two things going on. First of all, they live and die very quickly, so their bodies are actually going to become organic matter that can be decomposed easily by the soil party to help ramp up the soil party. That's one. And two, weeds usually come with a very particular talent. So they're coming to try to heal the soil. And the talents could be something like a really strong root that breaks up compaction, or maybe they're particularly good at mining for calcium or mining for magnesium or some other element. And that is, or maybe they fix nitrogen, you know. So these weeds are going to come into the landscape, and they are going to be immediately trying to help out the soil party. And really, I like to think about weeds as kind of like the guys who deliver pizza, right, to the party. You know, they come and they bring all this pizza, which is their bodies, the organic matter of their bodies, and they bring that to the party. And, you know, once you have pizza in a party, things start to really happen. So if you've got 100 years to build a garden, you just let this weed thing go on. It, you know, they live, they die, they live, they die. And eventually the soil party is big enough, robust enough, cycling nutrition enough that it can support woody plants and trees. Now, I don't have 100 years to build a garden anymore. You know, I want to have it pretty quickly. So if we want to bypass having to go through this phase of weeds, the way we do it is we bring our own organic matter. And when we bring organic matter to the party, we actually get these guys, the fun guys. The fun guys, fungi, are the awesome apex of the microbial community. They will actually connect together and create these vast networks that become really the skin of the soil. And the networks go for, they're miles and miles and miles of single cell network in just a footprint of healthy soil. So that area that your foot is on has miles of fungi in it. And the fungi perform this really, really important role. First of all, they're a transportation network across which nutrient and water and anything that could possibly be needed by a plant, immune response, everything gets transported across the network. And the other thing is that when the fungi are in place, now information actually gets transported across the network. So plants can begin to communicate with each other to talk, essentially give out signals and talk to each other about the conditions in the landscape. So things are a little dry. Okay, we're going to send water over to you. Okay, there's a pathogen going on here. The fungi will learn about the pathogen and spread information to other plants. This is, I mean, honestly, when we discovered that the fungal network was as extensive as it is, I mean, if any of you saw the movie Avatar, that is kind of the way it is, which is really, you know, it's out there, but that is kind of how it works. So when you see that the fungi are there, now you're having, this is like the real heavy engineering and construction crew on site, right? Because these guys actually connect up into the roots of the plants. And as I said, they transport all this information and materials across the network, and they also help the overall soil party to continue to engineer the soil as efficiently as possible to hold onto carbon and to hold on to water. And this happens super fast. So, and also, you know, mycologists talk about this as the internet of the, you know, the Wood Wide Web, basically. But also the archetype for other, if I don't know if any of you watch Discovery, Star Trek Discovery, there's an entire plot line about how navigation in the future is going to be through an interstellar fungal network. So there are some mycologists that would say, we dreamed that up because the fungi want that to happen. Anyway, so you can see from the architecture really of how the fungi work. You know, it is like an internet. It's got hubs, it's got nodes. It's really pretty incredible, and it grows incredibly fast. So when given the correct oxygen, food, water, this thing can, you know, for example, in compost tea, you can grow out a huge fungal mass in as little as 30 hours. So it's a really, really, really important part of everything. And when you start to see things like worms and pill bugs and other, you know, apex predators of the soil, then you know that the soil party is going on, because they actually eat microbes. You know, worms, the reason worm castings are so great is because the worms take in organic matter, but they're not eating the organic matter. They're eating the microbes off the organic matter, and then their digestive tract processes the organic matter and turns it into this stuff that's very attractive to microbes. So that's what's going on with earthworms, and that's why earthworm castings are so valuable, because they're covered excuse me, in really good microbial activity. And of course, the worms themselves are doing incredible benefit in the soil, aerating it and creating those pores that we need for the microbes to live in. Now, all the stuff that's happening in the soil actually is happening on the plant too, because all those microbes come up and cover the plant and create kind of like a defense shield around the plant. And, we have this as humans too. We're covered in protozoa and other bacteria, inside and out. And, the more we learn about the microbe community, the more fascinating it is. And we find out, like, even in humans, microbes intermediate almost every single thing that is going on. Every single function in the human body is intermediated in one way or another by a microbe. And actually the DNA expression, in genetic expression in all creatures is intermediated by microbes. And it's the same for plants. These microbes will cover the plant. They create a film on the plant. And so when a pathogen comes from a neighboring garden and lands in this garden, that pathogen is consumed. Worst case scenario, a couple of leaves are lost, but then those leaves fall to the ground, and the microbial community samples that pathogen and creates the defense that it needs. So it's kind of like creating a vaccine against against whatever the pathogen is. And this is how healthy living soil actually helps a plant defend. The other thing that I learned fairly recently is that when plants are growing, excuse me, when crops are growing in healthy living soil, their sugar content actually rises. Now, you may think, well, who cares about that? Well, insects do not have pancreases, and so they can't process sugar. So when you have a plant that's filled with sugar and insects come by, they don't stop there to eat. No, because they can't process it. They move on to the stressed plant. They move on to the plant that's, functioning not in healthy living soil. So another reason to build the soil. And where does this biology all live? I mean, it seems, kind of incredible. And we're hearing all the time, that soil is, 6 inches deep and all this stuff. And actually, that is a very old paradigm. Yes, okay, topsoil or organic matter definitely declines as you go down in a soil profile. And so this top horizon could be just a few inches, and in some places it's almost non-existent at all, but those top inches are the most organic matter filled inches of soil. And so those are traditionally called the topsoil. But, and then after topsoil, we have something called subsoil. And so subsoil is, it's not quite parent rock. It's a soil that is depleted. It might actually be filled with nutrient and minerals because they may have been added to the landscape and they seeped down into this subsoil layer. But generally the subsoil layer is doesn't have as much organic matter in it. It's not as, a rich environment. And then of course, as you go down even further, you get down into the place where there really isn't very much organic matter at all. You're basically in, the parent rock of the soil. So generally speaking, we think about the good soil as being just topsoil, like this top little bit of organic matter. But really, what we need to be thinking about is the rhizosphere. So this is the area around the roots of the plants, and this can be at any depth. There have been studies shown where trees and shrubs, trees in particular, have roots that are miles deep. I'm not talking just horizontal, I'm talking deep, miles deep. And you only get a root in a place where you have owl. There's no root if there's no owl. There has to be oxygen, there has to be water, and there has to be microbial life that is able to function there. And so the rhizosphere around every root really is where the soil party is. And that's where it's most biologically active because of course it's exchanging its nutrition with the plant. But this really kind of changes our thinking about what is valuable soil or what is important soil for us to preserve or for us to be thinking about. Because yes, of course, the organic matter on the top, that top little bit of topsoil is important. But what's really important is making sure that we can create plants that have big root depths. That is the thing that we're looking for. And the thing is that, and I'm going to follow along in the book. This is the same as yesterday, just to make sure that there isn't anything that's not overlapping. So what's going on is, as the roots are moving through the soil and the soil party is engaged around them in the rhizosphere, that soil party is, they're moving around, they're like pushing each other out of the way, they're living, they're dying. Then, when they die, they create a void space. Earthworms and other macroarthropods are coming through the soil, and they are consuming them, and then they're creating oxygen trails, and the bacteria and so forth are exuding a slime so they can all stick together and they can stick to soil particles. And what is happening now is this spongy soil is starting to take shape. And what I want to show you here is it's called a slake test. This is a test where you take a sample of soil and you put it in water to see how quickly it disintegrates. If a sample of soil disintegrates completely, it has no soil structure. There's nothing that's gluing it together or holding it together to create like a sponge. What you're seeing in this picture is essentially samples from two separate gardens. And there are two samples in each of those gardens. You can see that the left-hand samples that are in jars that are dirty water, these were samples taken from those gardens in compacted areas. So what is compaction? Compaction can happen mechanically, it can happen chemically, it can happen from overwatering, it can happen, mechanically is walking on it too. So yeah, it is essentially the pressing down of the soil so that the oxygen is no longer there in the soil. So we've actually compressed that soil structure down to being much more like a brick and getting rid of all the oxygen pore space that is in the soil. And when you have compacted soil, you do not have good soil structure. So these two that are in dirty glasses are from the compacted part of the site. And you can see that they took the clod and they put it in the soil and it just fell apart, right? And in fact, this woman here in the blue, in the middle, her hand's out of the jar already. That's how quickly her soil sample fell apart. Completely dead dirt. On the other hand, from the same garden, but in places that were not compacted, we have soil samples that are spongy. And look at what they look like. The one in the foreground actually looks like a sponge. At first, I saw this being done in person. I took this picture and I thought, wow, that looks like a sponge that she's holding there, but I know it's a soil sample. And you can see the soil sample that the woman in the olive colored coat has, that it has, roots and all kinds of stuff holding it all together. So this is what is called good soil structure. And you can do a slake test to determine that good soil structure. Now, something that the book, actually these slides are a little bit backwards, so I'm going to go do this one first. So the good soil structure, as I said, is created by the microbes. And basically what they are doing is they are gluing together particles and also aggregates of particles. So they glue together the particles to create aggregates, and then they glue the aggregates together to form macro aggregates. And the glue that they use is called glomalin. Glomalin is, it's like a bioslime. It's, I always think of glomalin, it's kind of gross, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I always think of glomalin when like I'm handling, meat from a package. You take it out and it's got that kind of slightly slimy feel to it. that is like glomalin. And so it's an organic material, and it is clumping the soil together and creating these aggregates. And it's within the aggregates that the oxygen, water, and life can really take hold. So the thing that is also interesting about all of this soil stuff is that soil has a sense of place. The organisms are unique to where they are. They have evolved with the cycles of the plants and the animals and the rainfall, and whether it's acidic soil or alkaline soil, all of that has been taken into account, and these microbes are particular to this place. That's why there's so much DNA sampling going on to determine who's in the soil party. And the carbon that is and these plants will then react with the plant in, as I said, to manufacture, or not manufacture, but engineer their soil. And one of the things that we need to remember is that in a place that doesn't have a lot of rainfall, for example, that is going to be a place where there's not going to be as much organic matter, if you think about it, right? Because the plant material is probably adapted to this arid condition, and so it's not where we're going to find the big leafy, you're not going to find a climax forest in a really super arid environment. The plants look completely different, and they have different adaptations because they're in that super arid situation. And the microbial community is also completely different there. When we move, and mostly that microbial community is less evolved. Okay, it's less dominated by fungi in the arid situation. It's going to be dominated by bacteria. It's like a younger soil. The plants that want to live in that environment, or can live in that environment, many of them live and die very, very quickly. They respond very quickly to conditions of just a little bit more water. Those are going to be plants that are more like weeds, frankly. And as that soil becomes more organic matter dominated, and that follows along with the rainfall patterns. So when we get more rain, we have more organic matter on the soil to be decomposed by the soil party. The soil party begins to shift and become more evolved. And so there's what we call a continuum of plants from this very basic forbs and grasses all the way up to climax forest. And I think we have a slide on that in just a minute. So no matter where they are, these plants are actually the living soil and the plants are working together in the root zone. And remember, that root zone could be huge, to sequester carbon. And the purpose of sequestering carbon is to create a soil sponge, so that it creates a place where water is going to be attracted to that carbon and held in that carbon. Something that's really interesting, there's been some amazing studies done about how much carbon is actually there. And it's estimated that in the soil of a healthy living soil system, there are 5 to 6 times the biomass of the plants above. And that includes the roots. So you take the plant above and, the plant, and you take that out and you calculate the biomass of that plant. In the soil, as a result of that plant having been in the soil, there's 5 to 6 times the biomass. So 5 to 6 times the carbon, right? Because biomass is basically carbon. And we have really been trained to think of roots as being quite short. And a lot of that comes from turfgrass, because, management of landscapes has kind of evolved from this turfgrass paradigm. And so our expectation of root depth is really, pretty shallow. When we have 6 inches of root depth on turf grass, we're doing the happy dance, and that is not the right paradigm for us to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about, how do plants who are adapted to a place, how do their roots grow? And let's imagine, right, that there's a soil party all over the roots of that plant. Those soil party is engineering the soil everywhere the roots are. If we have plants that have root depths of, in this case, 15 feet root depth, that means that we are sequestering carbon along that entire structure. That means that we're engineering soil in that entire structure. That means that we're creating a sponge down to 15 feet. We want to start to think differently about roots of plants and what's possible in our landscapes. We imagine we can't hold on to rainwater because, well, it happens at different times of the year necessarily than when the plant needs it, or there's too much of it, or whatever. We have all these excuses for why we can't hold on to rainwater. Yet plants in a particular place have adapted perfectly to have a system to hold on to the rainwater because they don't have someone irrigating them. So we want to try to really encourage and tap into this knowledge that the soil and plant community have, and help the plants, actually help the soil microbes work with us to support the plants. So this kind of begins to make us think about, what happens when root depth increases? What happens to the plant water requirement? Right? Now, plants available water. What is plant available water? Okay, plant available water is available water holding capacity of the soil times the root depth. Does anybody remember on the available water holding capacity chart which soil had the largest, by far, water holding capacity? Does anybody remember? The answer is not clay. Okay, clay was up there, but surpassing even clay was organic matter. Remember the peats and the mucks? They were the ones that had the highest water holding capacity. What if we had root zones of plants that are essentially giant carbon sponges, giant carbon organic matter columns? What if they were holding on to rainwater? What does that do to our plant available water? And what happens when we start increasing that root depth down beyond 6 inches, 18 inches, 20 inches? How much water would possibly be available to a plant over, and even better yet, accessible by the plant, because unlike being locked up in clay, when the water's locked in the organic matter, the plant can remove it. So these are things that we really need to be thinking about, because it kind of starts to blow apart a lot of our calculations about irrigation and our total irrigation runtime, for example, or our irrigation water requirement. Things change completely when we start to consider the soil having a structure that is inclined to holding on to water when it's dry and releasing the water when it's wet. Now, remember, the purpose of irrigation, we used to say, was basically to maintain the balance of oxygen and water. But now we can add the life to it. and say that the purpose of irrigation is to maintain owl. We want to make sure that we don't have too much water in the system so that there's no oxygen, because when we're saturated with too much water, the life that's going to form in that soil is pathogenic life. It's anaerobic life. And remember, everything needs oxygen. So pathogenic life is going to thrive in a saturated environment where there's no oxygen. And on the other hand, we're going to have a situation where there's plenty of oxygen, but that water film is too tightly bound onto the particles of the soil for the plant to get it. And in that situation, we've got lots of oxygen, but not enough water. And so the life ends up dying, sleeping. Much of it insists. It actually, kind of goes to sleep in this very hardened form, waiting for water again. And neither of those conditions is conducive for root growth. So that's why, if we are going to have irrigation, we need to be focused on this oxygen and water balance, and we need to start to take into consideration what happens when we have a different soil structure. When we apply things like pesticides, herbicides, and so forth, we are actually ending up, fungicides especially, we're actually ending up killing the taxis, right, that bring the good microbes to the soil. So all those things that don't have feet and need to be in your soil, and would be on a bee, or another insect, yeah, they're not going to get there because you've killed all those insects off. And fungicides, I mean, it's really important because the fun guys, remember, run the show. And fungicides, it's almost impossible to, it is. I mean, there's lots of labeling that goes on, but the truth is, it's impossible to have a completely single focused fungicide, single target fungicide. And, oh, by the way, why would you do it? Because the soil party is going to be so diverse and so robust that it would end up killing a pathogenic fungi. So, when you end up destroying that one particular fungi or try to take them out, you end up killing masses of fungi. And, oh, by the way, there's so many of them that we don't even know who they are yet. So don't use this stuff. You don't need it. The soil is going to make it right for us. And fertilizer is another thing that we can eliminate entirely from our program. And the reason is that, well, first of all of this a healthy plant that is evapotranspiring is getting plenty of carbon from the atmosphere. And the microbial community in the soil is manufacturing the nutrition that that plant needs in the quantity it needs when it needs it. When you put fertilizer on the soil, this, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, what ends up happening is the plant will favor that. It will take that up because it's available and it doesn't have to do any work for it. So it just takes up that nutrient. And, oh, by the way, most of it doesn't get taken up by the plant. Most of it is water soluble and ends up moving through the soil away to a waterway, okay, or down into the subsoil. So the plant takes a portion of it that it can take. And then it's like, hey, this is great stuff. Why am I spending all this time building my root system and soil party and manufacturing my soil when I could just be building my body, right? This feels good. So we put on above ground buff. We look great, lots of green. We put out the flowers. We got the fruit. It's all excellent, right? Except it's like one of those super buff people that has tiny little legs. It ignores its roots. It stops manning this, farming the soil party. It stops engineering its own soil. And, oh, by the way, when it does that, it becomes incredibly tasty to an insect. Insects come, they're like, look at that, juicy, juicy. start munching down, there's no sugar content because the soil microbes are the ones who make the sugar content. Doesn't have that. Instead, it's got other stuff, yummy, yummy. Insects love that. We're going to eat up all that good green, very weak, weak in terms of, it may not look weak because it might be bright green, but it's weak in terms of nutrition. It doesn't have, good nutrition. And then, of course, when the soil party is depleted, we start to get compaction, which means our root depth is harmed, which means we don't have as much oxygen and water in the soil, which means we don't have as much water in the soil, which means we have a stressed plant. And when we have a stressed plant, we get even more attack by insects and so forth. So we don't need this stuff. We need to eliminate these synthetic fertilizers, and even fertilizers that are not synthetic. They're not necessary. In small quantities, they might help in the very beginning when you're making a garden to try to get that soil party boosted. But by the time the plant is doing its thing, it doesn't need it. And you know what? I actually forgot something earlier on, and it's an important thing. When a plant is grown in healthy living soil and it's covered with all those microbes, and it drops its leaves onto the ground, and it drops its flowers and its fruit onto the ground at its roots, what is it doing? It's ensuring its health, because it's bringing pizza to its own soil party, and the pizza could not be better than its own body. So when a plant drops its leaves onto the ground, it is trying to build the organic matter in the soil party. It is trying to feed the soil party. We don't want to blow that stuff away, because that is the organic matter that's going to basically make the soil party better. So yeah, OWL, not NPK. And by the way, compaction can happen regardless of soil type. We've worked on sites that were sandy soil and completely compacted. And then mostly it's because of chemical compaction mixed with mechanical compaction. And if you think about it, glass is made from sand. So enough pressure, enough heat, and you get glass. Well, it's the same. You get stone when you have enough pressure and chemicals can turn sand into something. So it's funny because this slide is kind of out of order, but it's all right. This is actually part of this conversation about soil having a sense of place. So we could just kind of come back to it very quickly. The thing is that when the microbes are digesting the rock, the parent rock, that is like the ultimate sense of place, right? Because this is the essence of this particular place. This rock, has been here, for a very, very long time. And eventually the bacteria and protozoa and nematodes and so forth will start to actually create something that attracts the weeds. The weeds come and they start building up the organic matter. And there is a succession of plants that follows this building of the soil party. And this is really what you need to remember. And that is that in a bacterially dominated system, which is often a more arid system also, but a bacterially dominated system, which is also going to be alkaline, more alkaline. The plants that thrive are very simple plants. So there are going to be a lot of annual plants. There are going to be a lot of grasses. As the succession builds, as the soil party builds up, you start to get a little bit of fungi into the soil party, and those fungi start pairing. They pair with perennial grasses. And so they start to build those grasses that have those giant root structures. And but it's not the same fungally dominated landscape. There's still a lot of nutrient cycling through the bacteria and so forth. But as we move through time and as we move through climate, and we move toward a more acidic environment, we move toward a more a wetter environment, and in part these plants are making it that way. Oh, by the way, we'll talk about that in module 10. But as we move through time, the plants begin to change, and there's a succession going on, and we start to get into the forests of the softwood trees, and then the hardwood and climax forest. And when you get to that type of environment, you're now in a fungally dominated landscape. So you're moving from bacterial domination to fungal domination, with the bacterial domination pairing with the grasses and forbs and annual plants, and even like vegetables, for example, are often more bacterially dominated. And then as you move through time to the climax forests and woody shrubs, you are now in the fungally dominated landscape. Okay, what do you do if you have compaction in a landscape? Because, right, when you disturb the landscape, you're actually taking the soil party back to the beginning. Anytime that you disturb the soil, you're breaking up those fungal hyphae, you're disturbing all those aggregates that were created. And so the soil party is basically going back to the beginning. You're creating an environment that's going to be attractive to weeds, because it's a bacterially dominated landscape now, and the nutrients are not cycling as robustly as they will when the fungal dominance happens again. So we want to try to avoid disturbing our soils as much as possible. That means when you see people, chopping up soil to get rid of weeds, hello, that is actually creating weeds. And maybe there's a method to that madness, but that is actually the reason that the weeds are there, because you're chopping the soil up. You want to make a plan or think about landscape, think about renovation in the landscape, and taking action in a very, very targeted way. So yes, if you have compaction in the landscape, you're going to need to get oxygen into the soil. How do you do that with the least disturbance as possible? Is it that you're going to, hire a Leonardo da Vinci lookalike, or Matt Damon actually lookalike, to come to your, doesn't he, to come and till your landscape? Probably not, unless you're doing some kind of massive renovation where you are going to heal it immediately and add organic matter, and it's just a total overhaul. But in general, you don't want to disturb in order to disturb too much in order to do this, but you do have to get oxygen in. So you may need to do something like augering. So using an auger, even just a hand auger in the form of a drill bit, 18 inches long, 3/8 inch diameter, and poke holes into the soil so that in areas that are compacted, so that there's oxygen there. You're opening up those, you're pretending to be a worm. You're basically a mechanical worm, and you open up the soil and you immediately cover it with compost or really good worm castings and water it in, so that the soil can now start going on the oxygen, water, and life. If you have turf, you need to aerate it and dethatch it at least annually. This is going to allow oxygen to get into the soil. When you have thatch, that keeps oxygen and water from getting into the soil. When you have, again, compacted turf, it needs to have those oxygen pathways. And so aerating is the way to do that. But as soon as you dethatch and aerate, you follow up with compost and worm castings. You have to follow up with the organic matter so the soil party knows what to do. We need to feed the microbes, not the plants. And the stuff that the microbes want is compost, which is decomposed organic matter. It looks and smells like soil. It's this beautiful color, this dark, rich color. You can't really see any stuff in it, like you don't know what it is. And it looks like soil. Mulch sits on top of the soil. It should be about 1.5 inches or maybe a little smaller in the beginning anyway of the landscape. And you can tell what it is. It's twigs, it's leaves, it's stuff. And the thing about mulch is you're looking for a mulch that is both green and brown because you want it to decompose. So leaf mulch, that's leaves that are shredded along with wood that's shredded, is the best mulch. And so getting mulch, fresh mulch from a tree trimmer is probably the best way to go to have really, really good quality mulch. And I like to think of mulch as though it's like pizza in the freezer for the soil party. It sits on top of the soil, and the microbes and the worms and so forth come up and get what they need when they need it. We keep well, it says here 2 to 4 inches, but really now we're 3 to 4 inches of living mulch on the soil at all times. This suppresses the weeds, it keeps the moisture in, it keeps solar radiation down on the roots of the plants. And on top of it, it's organic matter that is going to be decomposed by the microbes. Actively aerated compost tea is another option. This is essentially brewing microbes in a bin. You brew them in water, 5-gallon bucket, and a 5-gallon bucket of really good compost that has been actively aerated. And so that's done with a pump that essentially puts enough oxygen into the container so that the microbes are kind of taken off of the organic matter that you've put in there. And you feed it a little bit of food in the form of well, not everybody feeds their actively aerated compost tea, but let's say you feed it a little bit of seaweed or some kind of molasses or something, and that will boost that microbial activity in there. And you can end up getting, from a 5-gallon bucket, you get enough to cover 1,000 square feet. And what you're putting out is not an infusion of nutrient, it's a live brew of microbes. So you're like inoculating the soil with microbes. Grass cycling is very important. If you are managing turf grass, you want to make sure that you're keeping the little clippings of grass on the turf so that they can decompose and that they can become the organic matter that the turf soil party is eating in order to keep things well. Hey, skip it. No weed fabric. Do not do it. If you see it down on a landscape, recommend it to be gone. It basically creates weeds. It prohibits the organic matter that's sitting on top from decomposing and forming good soil and helping the soil party out. So as a result, the dust and stuff on top of the weed fabric ends up becoming the place that the microbes try to fix. And so the weeds show up to try to fix that little tiny film on top of the weed fabric. And, then the roots grow right through it. And next thing you know, you can't even pull the weed fabric up. So don't even do it. Don't bother. There is a case study that is going to be in your packet, and it's very, very interesting to take a look at. It did happen in California, but I like to include it because people often think about these processes of converting landscapes into living soil as being something that can only be done, in very small scale. And this company, Cagwin and Dorwood, is a large maintenance company, and they actually remove grass only through sheet mulching, which is essentially a process of laying cardboard or paper. In this case, they have a particular type of cardboard that's wet, and compost and mulch. And in putting all that down, they end up sparking the microbial community to decompose the grass and create healthy living soil. It's pretty freaking amazing. It's the only way that they remove grass, and they are incredibly successful doing it. And I think this should be a nationwide phenomenon. And that ends the living soil module.